Okay, Buchem Abayim to the 12th in a continuing series of shiurim on the Yud Gimel Ikkarim of the Rambam, the 13 Principles of Faith. And at the end of last week's shiur, I mentioned that I gave a little introduction to what's called the Sefer HaMitzvos, which is the 8th principle, which the Rambam speaks called Torah min hashamayim, namely that the Torah is divine, Torah from heaven. I'm going to read through the Sefer HaMitzvos, and we're going to actually focus on several of the important Nakudas points that the Rambam brings. The Sefer HaMitzvos is crucial, of course. Now, this is a crucial principle, essential principle in Judaism. But in addition to that, it's very important to understand the Rambam's understanding and where it fits into the Rambam's shita in the divinity, both of the Torah Shebechsav and the Torah Shebe'al Peh. Okay, the Sefer HaMitzvos, Hu Torah min hashamayim. That means Torah from heaven. For who? And it is, and what the principle is, I'm reading once again from the Shilat edition, Daf Kuf Mem Dalet, of the Hakdama of the Rambam, to Parachelek, the peirushim Mishnayos. For who? And it is Lahamin Shekol HaTorah Zois HaMetzuya Din HaYom Hazeh, the entire Torah which we have today, Hiya Torah Nesun LaMoshe. This is the Torah that was given to Moshe Rabbeinu. For she Kula Mipi Gvura. And all this Torah is Mipi Gvura, means from Kodesh Baruch Hu. Ritzoni Loima, that is to say, Shegia Elav Kula Me'eres Hashem. The entire Torah came from Kodesh Baruch Hu. Now, it's called Dibor. Now, the Rambam says Al Derech HaShala because, as we know, Kodesh Baruch Hu doesn't speak in the same sense that any other person speaks. Hashala means we're using a term, an anthropomorphic term, right, just because there is no other term to speak about communication, but the term is used Derech HaShala. In other words, it's borrowed from an anthropomorphic term, from a term that's used in ordinary language to describe the revelation of Torah from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Of course, the only one who in fact actually apprehended this, right, is of course Moshe Rabbeinu. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu is the only person who knows how actually this, what's called Dibor, came from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because he's the only one who actually heard the Torah himself. Now, says the Rambam, Moshe Rabbeinu is b'madregas sofer, which means he has the he's a scribe. Shekolim loy, that we read to him, v'u kosev kula, and Moshe Rabbeinu writes. He's a scribe. We dictate, we read to him. I shouldn't read. We say to him, and he writes it. Now, what did he write? So, speaking about the entirety of the Torah, Divrei Yomeh, right? Any history that appears in the Torah, Sipureh, the stories of the Torah, Umitzvoseh, and the mitzvahs of the Torah. In other words, all three parts of the Torah either accounts, the Torah gives accounts of things that happened in history, Sipureh, and the other stories of the Torah, and the mitzvahs of the Torah. All of this was written by Moshe Rabbeinu, Mipi Gvura, and Moshe Rabbeinu, and all these sections is none other than a cipher, a scribe. The Kach Nikra, and if Moshe Rabbeinu is called, the Rambam, in fact, quotes the word used in the Chumash, B'choykek, meaning a scribe. Now, the Rambam says that the entire Torah was written equally, in the same manner. The Ein Hefdel Bein, there's no difference between the psukim of V'nei Cham, Kush, Mitzrayim, Ufut, Canaan, V'shem Ishta, Meitavel, Bas, Matre. In other words, there's no difference between psukim, which appear to give details which ostensibly are not so significant, or between Anochi Hashem, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. In other words, there's no difference between what appears to be sort of like insignificant parts of the Torah, of the Chumash, and those parts of the Torah which appear to be central, like Anochi, right? Hakol Mipi Gvura. Everything comes from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Hakol Teretz Hashem Tamima, right? Tahira Kedosha Emes. In other words, everything is equal in stature, right? Everything is equal in holiness, in truth, etc. Okay. And in addition to that, the Rambam goes on and says that whoever believes that the Torah, and quotes the Gemara Sanhedrin, whoever believes that the Torah is all b'pia gevura, chusli pasuk echad. The person says even one pasuk was not said directly to Moshe Rabbeinu, was not said by Kodesh Baruch Hu. Shalom Kodesh Baruch Hu ela Moshe b'atzma. The person will claim that even one pasuk was said by Moshe Rabbeinu himself, and he didn't get it from Kodesh Baruch Hu, did not dictated to him, right? And this the pasuk says, Devar Hashem Boza. He's degraded the word of God. Is Allah Hashem Imam HaKoifer. Ela kol mila mimena. Every word the Torah from Moshe Rabbeinu, and of course yesh bo chachmos ufloim l'mi shevinu Hashem. And of course there are tremendous wisdom and depth, right, on every word. V'lo tusag tachlis chachmos. Of course, no person can possibly apprehend the entirety of its wisdom. And the Rambam quotes the pasuk, "Arukim me'eretz mido u'chavim min hayam." It's longer than the land and wider than the sea. Okay, now. And therefore, in other words, the Rambam has said a lot of things. We're going to go into this in a lot of detail. But this is actually what I'm not going to actually speak about right now. We're going to get to the Torah of. But the Rambam, the Chiddush, would be the Chiddush of the Rambam, the novel feature of the Rambam's Ikkarim, is that not only is the Chumash all Mipiat Gvura from a Kodesh Baruch Hu, I mean, that is something that should not surprise anyone. But the important point here is that the Rambam says that the Torah Shebe'al Peh is also Min HaShamayim. And this is the final part of the Rambam speaks about Uchmo Chen Peirush HaMekubal. That is the Peirush HaMekubal, the accepted interpretation. We'll speak what this term actually means. Who gam ke mipia gvura. This is also mipia gvura. V'zeh asher naseh hayom mitei hasukkah. Right? Today, the sukkah that we make, halulav, shofar, tzitzis, tefillin, uzulasam, all these things that we have today. Hu be'eni ater she'om Hashem l'Moshe v'om alanu. This is the same sukkah. This sukkah and lulav looks the same thing as that we said to Moshe Rabbeinu, and Moshe Rabbeinu has told us. For telling us the exact description of all these mitzvahs that Kodesh Baruch Hu commanded him. We can rely upon Moshe Rabbeinu that he has conveyed us faithfully all the details. And then, right? How do we know that, in fact, actually, all of these things, what is the source in the Torah which tells us this ikra, this principle? Because Moshe Rabbeinu says, I didn't make this up, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in fact, has sent me as a messenger to impart to you his mitzvah, to impart you the Torah. Now, the Chumash, actually, like I said before, that's something that should be understood, that Chumash is Min HaShamayim. But what does the Rambam, and that should be clear, that every word is equal in stature. I think everybody would agree upon that. We will speak about it, of course, what the Rambam means in detail. But the second part of the shoresh, like I said before, that here is what is really requires certain analysis, because the Rambam says, Kamokin peirush HaMekubal. The peirush HaMekubal, as I'm going to translate it to be, is the accepted interpretation. Ugam can be piyah gevur. It's also from a Kodesh Baruch. Okay? And the Rambam, in fact, actually says this not only in Yisod HaShmini, but he actually says this in the beginning of the Yad, and I've done it to the Yad. The Rambam of the Yad, the Rambam begins his first introduction to the Yad HaChazaka, just that we know that the Rambam is consistent. The Rambam says, "Kol ha-mitzvah shnidlu Moshe b'Sinai b'peirushim nitnu." All mitzvahs that were given to Moshe Rabbeinu at Sinai were given together with their interpretation, peirushim. Shenema, says the Rambam, "Ve'ed l'chas haluchas ha'ev v'ater mitzvah v'amitzvah." Right? I will give you haluchas v'ev v'ater v'amitzvah. So, the drasha that the Rambam is recording, what does it say, ha'ter v'amitzvah? Why two things? So, the Rambam says, this is a drush of Chazal in a condensed version, Torah zu Torah shebachsav, mitzvah zu peirushim. In other words, sivanu. So therefore, we see clearly in the pasuk that Chazbon gave to Moshe Rabbeinu not only the Torah shebachsav, but the Torah shebe'al-peh, which is called the tzivanu lo Torah al pi mitzvah. So the intention of the pasuk to tell us HaTorah mitzvah we're supposed to do the Torah. We're commanded the Torah, which is the Torah shebachsav, based upon the mitzvah. Right? The mitzvah is the peirush HaTorah, the commentary, the meaning, the interpretation of the Torah. Mitzvah zu hi nikush Torah shebe'al-peh. And this mitzvah is called Torah shebe'al-peh. So once again, the Rambam clearly is being consistent that not only is the Torah shebachsav given at Sinai, but also is the Torah shebe'al-peh. The question that we have to raise is what the Rambam, in fact, speaks about what's called peirushim mekubalim. And what does peirushim mekubalim mean? And the Rambam gives examples: sukkah, lulav, shofar, tzitzis, tefillim, zulasa. But why does the Rambam give these specific examples of peirushim mekubalim? So, for this, we're going to turn now to the Hakdama of the Rambam to his entire Peirush HaMishne. In other words, that is to say, that the Hakdama that we've been learning in the Ikkarim is the Hakdama to his Peirush Mishne and Perach the last Perach Sanhedrin. However, the Rambam wrote an general introduction to his Peirush HaMishne, right, which is also has a Shilat edition, and there the Rambam defines what's called peirushim mekubalim. Okay, now says the Rambam like this. So the Rambam says that he wants to speak about an Ikar Gadol, an important concept, a central concept. This is in Daf Lamed Ches in the Shilat edition. For who? Sheish lo imaloyma. Okay? In peirushim Torah, if the peirushim of the Torah, as we've explained, come from Moshe Rabbeinu, right, like we explained, Kol HaTorah, Nema Kolosav V'Seh Duksa Sinai, right? The Chazal say, this is right, that Kol HaTorah, the Klolim and the Pratim, the Pukayim come from Sinai. Mahin oisim halachas yechidas shiurim, right? Bahem halachas Moshe Sinai. The Rambam is a question. The Rambam says that the Gemara, we see many times the Gemara calls specific halachas Moshe Sinai. So says the Rambam, if the Peirush Torah, which is mekubal to Moshe Rabbeinu, is Sinai, so what the Gemara says specific things halachas Moshe Sinai. So says the Rambam, וזה עיקר רוי שתמיד עליו, והוא שפירושים מקובלים מוישה, פירושים that are מקובל from Moshe Rabbeinu, I say accepted commentaries, but these commentaries that we have as tradition from Moshe Rabbeinu, אין מחלוקת בהם בשום פנים. There cannot be any, there's no מחלוקת. לפי שמעולם לא מצאנו מחלוקת אפילו בין חכמים. We have never found any dispute among חכמים, from Moshe Rabbeinu until Rav Ashi, שאמר, who said, that Misha Sime ain't Adam Tisami Eino. We've never seen someone who suggests to say that if you blind a person's eye, you should blind him back. And Ayin Ba'ayin. And then we said, V'lo matzanu gamkin machloikis v'mam Hashem pri'etz hada, that someone said, right, that it shouldn't be an esrog. Everybody agrees, pri'etz hada refers to an esrog. And no one ever said, Eitz always is not a hadas. And no one, right? And it goes on and on and on. Right? Okay, so therefore we see that there are certain mitzvahs that no one ever argued on. In other words, why in fact do we see no machlokas on any of these things? This is because these are peirushim that we have as a tradition of Moshe Rabbeinu. And on that Chazal say, Kol HaTorah nemu kolosev v'seh b'Sinai. Okay? That's what it said. So the Rambam speaks about creates order, etc., right? we haven't seen anyone take the right. There's no machlokes of esrog and lulav, and he goes on and on and on. Okay, one second. Let me just finish. Okay, so the Rambam then goes on, right, and explains that in all these things we've never seen anyone interpret, let's say, the pasuk of Pri Eitz Hada to mean anything other than the Abaminim that we have. Yeah. Question?
When the Rambam says then that Torah Shabbat Peh is
we're going to speak about this. I'm starting step by step, okay, before we jump to other things, okay? So this is what's called peirushim, mekubalim, mimesha. The Rambam says these are things that we've never seen anyone argue on in the history of Judaism. Okay? Okay, so in other words, says the Rambam, right? But nonetheless, no one says that Pri Eitz Hada, which is an assertion, is halacha b'Shem Sinai. Even though, for sure, the peirush comes from Moshe Rabbeinu. So, the Rambam says, what's called halacha b'Shem Sinai is something, right, that doesn't come from a pasuk. Right? Okay? In other words, something which is not a pasuk, it's not based on a pasuk, an interpretation of a pasuk, right? And you can't derive from a pasuk. On this it says halacha b'Shem Sinai. So in other words, we have peirushim mekubalim, which certainly come from Sinai, but they're not. But since they are peirushim of pasukim, they are interpretations of verses. So they come from the verses. So the Gemara is not saying explicitly halacha b'Shem Sinai. For sure, they're from Moshe Rabbeinu. Sinai. That's called peirushim mekubalim. And so why it's called peirushim mekubalim? Because in fact, they are interpretations of psukim. But those halachas, and the Rambam actually goes and lists halachas which have no basis in the Torah Shebechsav. They're not interpretations of psukim. They don't come from psukim. So this, the Rambam says, the Gemara says to this specifically as halacha l'Moshe b'Sinai. Okay, now, however, the question is, what about halachas that are derived through drashas of psukim, through interpretation of psukim, in which we see machlokes? What are these? So, the Rambam goes on and he lists three categories. He lists four categories, but we'll speak about the three main categories. And this is on Daf Mem, page Mem in the Shilat edition. Hachelek Harishon, says the Rambam, the first category of laws are peirushim mekubalim mimoshe. Laws that we've received the tradition from Moshe Rabbeinu, sheyesh lahem ha'ira b'kasav. That in fact actually come from psukim, from verses. Or efshal tzim hekesh, one can derive them from a verse. There was never any machlokes dispute over these laws, right? When a person says kibalti kach v'kach, this is I have a tradition on these things. There's no argument on it. Okay, that's the first division, and the Rambam has listed, for examples of this. The Abaminim, for example, the four species that we take on Sukkos, the Esrog, Lulav, Hadassim, and Ahavos. Okay, now, the second group of laws, says the Rambam, Chelek HaSheni, Hemadinim HaShenem B'Behem Shem Halacha L'Moshe b'Sinai. Things that the Gemara explicitly says Halacha L'Moshe b'Sinai. Ve'ein Raya Aleim K'Moshe Zachanu. And these are laws, inevitably, laws which they're not coming from a verse, they're not interpretations of a verse. And says the Rambam, on these there's no machlokes. That's the second category. Now, what about the third category? There's a third category. Because after all, what comes next is, what about those halachas that we see? There is a machlokes, even though they are drashas, from psukim, they're from psukim. So, Afaylech HaShlishi, the third category, says the Rambam, okay? Heim hadinim hamutzoyim b'darkei hekesh. These are laws that are learned through logic. Hekesh means logic, but they're laws that are learned through the let's say the Yud Gimel Midas, the 13 ways of interpreting Scripture. In other words, the laws that are learned, these are laws that are learned from Psukim using logical, hermeneutical rules. Says the Rambam, V'tibul b'hem machlokes, k'mo shulchanu, and these are halachas that we find that this is machlokes, and the Rambam says that why these are in fact actually Yam machlokes, and why is there machlokes? Because ha'inin shokl mitzad ha'iyun. Otherwise, it's possible to learn things in different ways. Okay. Says the Rambam, why do you get machlokes? Because there's no tradition. There will be disputes on something where there isn't a tradition. There's going to be dispute. And the Rambam gives examples of this in Shas. The Gemara says, what's the difference? My beineyu. Now, says the Rambam, right, is that there are certain people who claim that everything is from Moshe Rabbeinu Sinai. Except in what? How come we have machlokes? Because someone didn't hear right, they made a mistake, etc., etc. Says that the Rambam now rejects this. The Rambam says, "Al machshavas bi shechoshiv shadilim nechol behem hem gam kem mekubalim b'Moshe." Says the Rambam, he who thinks that even laws in which there's a dispute are also a tradition from Moshe Rabbeinu. For Amnam nafla machlokes b'derech hatos. However, why is there a dispute? There was a mistake. Someone forgot something. One person got it right. One person didn't get it right. Shachach, he forgot. He didn't hear everything that his teacher told him. And they bring a guy from a Gemara like this. Rambam comes with a Gemara otherwise. Says the Rambam, this is a terrible thing, says the Rambam. They're the words of a person who doesn't understand things. He's not pedactic, he's not careful in the fundamental laws, the fundamental concepts of the Torah. What you're doing is that you're assigning very poor, ill repute to those people who receive the Torah. It's a kulubata. Because if you claim that there's machlokes because people forgot something, so what are you saying? You're saying there's no tradition. There is a tradition, but it was bumbled. You're saying Chazal just all make mistakes. You tried to defend Chazal by saying it's a Messiah. On the contrary, you're saying that Chazal didn't know what they were talking about. They were making mistakes left and right. Okay? So, in other words, clearly here in the Rambam, we see, and the Rambam, in fact, makes the claim that for sure, any place where there's a machlokes, one thing is for sure, there could not have been a tradition, a Kabbalah. That's what the Rambam says. The Rambam says very, very clearly. Okay. Now, so therefore, how are we to understand what the Rambam says in Yisod HaShmini? The Rambam picked out Sukkah, Lulav, Shofar, Tzitzit, Tefillin for a certain reason. No one has ever doubted that when it says, it speaks about that's speaking about phylacteries. No one's ever doubted that. No one's ever doubted that, right? That when the Torah speaks about Asulam Tzitzis, speaking about fringes. Everybody agrees there's fringes on tzitzis. Everybody agrees that it's when it says Yom Tuah Yalachem, it's speaking about a shofar. Everybody agrees in the lulav, in sukkah. These are called peirushim mekubalim in Moshe Rabbeinu. On this, a person has to believe, says the Rambam, that these are halach, these are Sinai. For all intents and purposes, halach should be Sinai, and this is called Torah min hashamayim. But, says the Rambam, other halachas, which actually constitute, according to the Rambam's own words in shiur sheni, the majority of laws learned through drashas from Pesukim, these are not Sinai. They're not a tradition. If they were tradition, there wouldn't be a machlokes.
Rabbeinu Tam Tefillin?
No, there's a machlokes that been a Tam and Rashi, but the parish is in the Tefillah. That's a machlokes. That can be a Kabbalah. But the Rambam is speaking about just Tefillah themselves. Let's speak about the details of things. What I'm saying is it says the Rambam, for sure, this is certainly not Shamayim. On the contrary, if it's been a Shamayim, then it makes fun of Chazal. So, in other words, what the Rambam is actually stating here in the Yisod Shmini is not that all of Torah Shbial Peh, even Torah Shbial derived from Psukim, is Min HaShamayim. What the Rambam says, there are certain things, Psukim, Lulav, etc., which are called peirushim mekubalim, commentaries that we have as tradition from Moshe Rabbeinu, which we've accepted from Moshe Rabbeinu. These, and only these, we're required to believe are min hashamayim. Now, what's interesting is, the Rambam begins the Hakdama to the Mishne Torah that speaks about Torah zu Teshuvah, mitzvahs peirushim, that's I explained, and the Rambam clearly states, "V'tzivanu l'aseh ha'Torah al pi ha'mitzvah." Reading from the Hakdama to the Mishne Torah, we're commanded the Torah al pi ha'mitzvah, u'mitzvah zu yanikreis Torah shvi'al peh. And the Rambam clearly says that the mitzvahs were given to Moshe Rabbeinu with peirushim, with their peirush. Yeah, question.
So within these three delineations, where did the crime draw their line?
We'll get this a little while. We're going to get a little while. This is... Now, so the Rambam is clearly saying that the peirush ha-mitzvah, right, the peirush of the mitzvah, was given at Sinai. This is the Rambam begins, the Hakdama. And the Rambam doesn't actually mention explicitly here in the Hakdama peirushim mekubalim. However, it's clear that the Rambam didn't change his mind in Hakdama to the Mishne Torah. Because the Rambam goes on, okay? And the Rambam says, he speaks about Moshe ad Rabbeinu HaKadosh, from Moshe Rabbeinu to Rabbi. So he says, Lo chibu shvladim Moshe berabim tesh bi'apeh, Ela b'chol dov ador every generation, Rosh Bezdin ul Navi, Sheyabais Yador Kosev li'atzmai zichon shmuas, every person would write himself notes, things Shomri Rabboisav, V'ken kol achad Kosev li'atzmai kifi koiche b'bir ha'Torah milchosea, from the interpretation of the Torah, from the halachas, K'moshe Shama, as he heard, Umidvorim shenitzchachu b'chol dov ador, b'dinam, and things that were mischadish, things that were learned new every generation, shaloi lomdu mipi hashmuah, which weren't learned mipi hashmuah, ela b'mida mishleishes midas, from something learned mishleishes midas. So it's interesting. The Rambam here says, Madaik in the Rambam says everyone would write Mibiyah HaTorah. I claim it peirushim mekubalim, Hilchosea, probably halacha l'meisha miSinai, K'moshe Shama, as he heard from a tradition. And then the third category is midvarim shenischatchu b'chol davador, things that were mischadis, things that were learned ex nihilo in every generation, b'dinim shaloi lomdu b'yashmuah, things that were not learned b'yashmuah, ela b'mida mishleishes midas, that were learned, and the best of them was maskir. So clearly, once we finish, okay? Clearly, the Rambam did not change his mind, chas v'shalom, in the Hakdama. He's delineating this delineation, the three categories in the Hakdama to the Mishne Torah. Let me just go a little bit further, and then we'll discuss. Now, and by the way, in case you think it's a toes, the Rambam actually repeats this same thing later on in the Hakdama. So, the fact is that the Rambam the Hakdama acknowledges is perfectly consistent with his Hatama to the peirushim Mishne. The question is, why doesn't the Rambam make this explicit in the opening lines when he says, "Kol ha-mitzvah shenilu Sinai peirushim nitnu, shenema ve'ed lecha luchas ha'ever Torah mitzvah Torah zu Torah shemasabu as a peirusha, v'sivan osets ha'Torah al pei ha-mitzvah, u'mitzvah zu yanikris Torah shbi'al peh." So why did the Rambam make the statement that the mitzvah were given with a commentary, with their explanation, and he brings a pasuk, and he doesn't really, in fact, actually, in other words, he doesn't specify peirushim mekubalim. So, this is what I'd like to address right now. But, John, you have a question?
Didn't the Rambam say that one of the three categories of halacha Moshe Sinai was hekesh, which was one of the
No. That's a different thing. That hekesh, we'll speak about that. That's the midas themselves might be halacha Moshe Sinai, but things learned are necessarily that. That's a different type of thing. Okay, now, the Gemara says explicitly in Bava Kama Kuvav and Beis that you can't be meishiv on hekesh because it's a Kabbalah. The hekesh itself is a Kabbalah. Okay, now, Shami and Psachim Paravav Alacha Aleph, look in the shiurim on the Yud Gimel Midas and ashkafusakol.com. There, I think I discussed that in quite a amount of detail. Okay, I think we have to understand what is the Rambam coming to do in this Akdama to the Mishne Torah. Now, of course, the Rambam is coming to. If we look at the Akdama, the Rambam begins the Akdama with the drasha. Ve'ed lecha es luchas ever Torah mitzvah. Torah is a shoresh mitzvah is a peirushim. And then after that, the Rambam lists all the generations from Moshe Rabbeinu until Ravina and Rav Ashi who will say Pharaoh. What's the Rambam doing? Okay. In addition to presenting to us with the Kabbalah without tradition, it would seem to me that what the Rambam is trying to do is, in a certain sense, to rebut or to blunt the attack of the Ikkarim. You spoke about the Ikkarim, the Karaites. The Karaites, of course, not only did they disagree with Chazal on this specific things learned from the Psukim, but actually the Karaites actually rejected the whole notion of that Torah should be al peh was Sinai. They rejected the Torah notion. One of the questions that the Karaites raised was, where does it say, where is the concept of Torah should be al peh even alluded to in the Chumash? In addition, the Karaites believed that there was actually no tradition. So their tradition was just as good as Chazal's. On the contrary, right? And certainly, they certainly didn't accept the authority of Chazal, which for us would really mean, in fact, actually the authority of the Gemara, of the Shas. Now, what the Rambam does is he takes the Karaites on in this introduction. What I want to speak about now, specifically, is the Karaite claim is that you don't have any allusion to the oral law in the Chumash. And therefore, the concept of the oral law was made up later on after Moshe Rabbeinu. And this, the Rambam brings the pasuk. Why say Torah v'ha-mitzvah? Just say Torah. So says the Rambam, the pasuk, which distinguishes between the words Torah and mitzvah, is telling us that Torah is Torah, mitzvah is peirushim. In other words, the Rambam is saying, here we have, in the Chumash itself, an allusion, a reference to a Torah shbi'al peh. Because there's no reason to say Torah v'ha-mitzvah. Now, if you've learned Gemara, you should have a different question on the Rambam. Because, is there a Gemara brachas here? Because this drasha that the Rambam presents to us in the beginning of the Mishne Torah is actually an abbreviated form of actually a longer drasha, which the Gemara in brachas, we see the Gemara in brachas in Daf Hey Amud Aleph. In Daf Hey Amud Aleph, the Gemara there presents us with a long drasha, which actually, in fact, explicates every part, Shakaya, thank you very much, of this pasuk. Okay, Hayim and Aleph. The Gemara says like this. I'm on Hayim and Aleph in Brachos. Amar Levi Bachama Rav Shin ben Lakish. Mai Dichsiv. What is the meaning of the pasuk? Ve'et l'chais luchas le'ever ater mitzvah shkat lo yiroisa. Luchais, says the Gemara, Elu assertion hadibros. These are the assertion hadibros. Torah is mikra. Mitzvah is Mishne. Asher kasafti, Elu neviim ksuvin. Lo yiroisam ze Gemara. That's the actual drosha as it appears in the Gemara. Now what did the Rambam do? Okay, Luchas Evan, the Rambam had nothing to say because clearly the assertion hadibros are according to the Chumash. Now, Torah, that's Torah Shebachsav. Now, what is mitzvah? So the Gemara says mitzvah is Mishne. Asher Kasafti is Nevi'im and Ksufin. The Eroisim refers to Gemara. The Rambam left out Gemara. Clearly Gemara, according to the Rambam, is not literally a tradition of Moshe Rabbeinu. If the drushes are not, if there's any place where there's machlokes, and most of Gemara is machlokes, clearly Gemara is not a tradition of Moshe Rabbeinu. At least, you can't see all of it is. Now, the Vim Kesuvim, the Rambam left out because he had no reason to include it here. Rambam's coming to blunt the attack of the Ikkarim, the Karaites, and they're not, we're speaking about Torah Sheb'al Peh. But with the Rambam learned mitzvah zu Mishne, and the Rambam claims that in Navdama, the Rambam doesn't say that mitzvah refers to Mishne, but it says mitzvah refers to the peirush of the Torah. Here's the peirush of the Torah, which certainly there are Mishnayos, which are actually the peirush of the Torah. Okay? The first Mishnah in Brachos, or in Brachos Hayim and Aleph, right? I mean, it speaks about Kriya Shema. Kriya Shema is a peirush of the Torah when the Torah says V'yil ve'me'ela, right? In other words, when the Torah commands us, right? In other words, that clearly is mitzvah's creation, but that we know from the Mishnah. But what's interesting is that Rambam took this drush of Chazal, and what he did was he abbreviated it in other words, to a bare minimum in which Torah refers to the Torah Shebachsav, mitzvah is to the peirush HaTorah. Now, clearly, this was all the Rambam needed, and clearly the Rambam cannot include Gemara, because Gemara certainly, at least according to the Rambam, is not literally from Moshe Rabbeinu, only peirushim mekubalim. But it's interesting that the Rambam didn't say mitzvah zu Mishne, he says mitzvah ze peirusha. So, it would seem to me that the Rambam understood, was presenting this pasuk not as a drasha. The Rambam understood that this is actually what's called the pshat, the meaning of the pasuk. The Rambam says in the second Sheker, Sefer HaMitzvos, he brings the Gemara in Samach Gimel, in Shabbos, Ein mikra yesi b'nei peshuta. Even though Chazal may make a drasha, there's always a simple meaning of the pasuk. So the Rambam was faced with a quandary. If the Karayim didn't believe in Torah Sheb'al Peh, you can't prove them as a Torah Sheb'al Peh by making a drasha. They'll say we don't believe you. And the Rambam would have brought Rav Ivya. The Rambam would have brought the Shlokish and say, in other words, this is mitzvah zu Mishne. They'll say, well, how are you trying to prove to me that there are drashas midiraisa? We don't believe in drashas. You can't do it through a drasha. You can't do it through a drasha. So what the Rambam did was, he wasn't bringing the drasha and Hayim and Aleph. He was bringing what he understood to be the pshat the simple, I call it quote unquote simple, intended meaning of the pasuk. Torah v'mitzvah means the Torah together with its interpretation, which is the peirush ha-Torah. And that's what the Rambam is doing. So chas v'sholom, the Rambam is not coming to argue with Chazal. The Rambam couldn't use Chazal because if you use Chazal, to use Chazal as a proof of Chazal is not a proof of anything. I mean, it's a proof to the it's preaching to the
Choir.
preaching to the
Choir.
to the choir. No, it's preaching to the converted. So therefore, when the Rambam says Torah zu Torah shmachzah mitzvah zu peirusha, the Rambam understood to be the pshat of the pasuk. Chazal darshan differently. Ein mikra yetze b'dei pishuto, says the Rambam b'sheresh beis. Meaning that what? And even as a drasha, there's always a pshat in Chazal. As the pshat in Chazal, this pshat in Chazal, that the Rambam was addressing the karoyim. Okay? Very interesting. Okay, now, so Adkan, until now, we've spoken about peirushim mekubalim. Of course, there's a lot to speak about here because this is the tip of a precipice, an iceberg. But I'm not going to go into the drashas anymore in detail at this point. But what I want to do is I want to go back to the first part of the Rambam. Like I said before, the chiddush here, what's novel here is that the Rambam understands that certainly a person is required to believe not only in the Torah Sh'nav and Torah Sh'Be'al Peh, as being Mipiat Gvura. It's interesting is that one might want to reflect upon this, as saying is, in other words, no one has argued on any of these things from time of Moshe Rabbeinu, which is actually tantamount to saying that in fact actually there is something called a tradition that comes from Moshe Rabbeinu. On a footnote, I might want to mention that the Chazon Ish in Yeredeya speaks about to what extent is a person, let's say, still considered to be included among those people who are not a kaifel. He speaks about, there's none from Jew make yayin nesach, etc., etc. And Chazon Ish also has a interesting definition of Jewish person who believes somehow in something called the Jewish tradition, which would actually is not very, very far from the Yesod HaShmini, the 8th principle of the Rambam. But in any case, what I want to do is I want to begin actually the first part of the Rambam, which is the part of the Rambam which deals with the divinity of the Chumash, which is the Torah Sh'Machzav, the written law. Now, up till now, the Rambam begins and says it was given to Moshe Rabbeinu. It's from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Moshe Rabbeinu, of course, is called a Mechoykek. He's called a Sefer, right? And the Rambam says there's no difference between, right, psukim which ostensibly appear insignificant, right, such as V'necham Kush, Mitzrayim, Ufut, Chanaan, and between Anechi, Hashem Elokecha. But it seems the Rambam leads up to this, and finally the Rambam says, right, that Kol Ella, but rather Kol Mila Mimena, every word in the Torah, Yesh Ba Chachmos Ufloyim L'Misha V'No Hashem. This great, profound wisdom in every word. For someone who is Kadosh Baruch Hu has given him the wisdom to understand. V'lo Tusak Tachlis Chachmasa, and no one can possibly reach it's infinite. The Torah is infinite. What do I have to know this for? I mean, it's a nice drasha. What do I have to know this for? Then he brings the pasuk, right, from David HaMelech, Gal Einayim V'Bidul Fos B'Sei L'Sechem. It seems to me that The Rambam is clearly not stating dogma here. I mean, it's dogma to believe that everything is that the Torah is divine. But why do I have to believe that there's infinite wisdom and profundity in every word of the Torah? What is? Not only that, I would say even more so, it would appear from what the Rambam is writing that actually that's the real belief. Because, B follows A. If everything is divine, then of course there's great profundity. In other words, what the Rambam seems to be making is that the profundity of the Torah, the infinitude of the Torah, is really the central principle, the central consequence of this principle, which he's making, this is the 8th principle, the 13th principle. Why is this true? Okay, that, the Mitzvah Hashem, we're going to have to discuss next time, because that's going to involve us in a quite interesting and conversation and discussion. Until next time, from still undisclosed place in Yerushalayim of HaKodesh, have a nice week. Be well.